All right, everyone. The first thing I want to do is welcome everyone to today's class. We're going to be talking about a really cool topic. Don't worry, we're not going to get real crazy, gory, and scary type of thing. But one of the topics that often comes up that we really think needs some attention is this idea of wildlife attacks, because unfortunately they happen all the time. You could literally pick up or get online every day and you could read about some situation where wildlife has caused an injury, or in the worst case, heaven forbid, a fatality to a human being. But these things happen all too often. And many times we can ascertain the reasoning why these wildlife attacks occur. And if you know the reasoning, there's oftentimes prevention or preventative steps that you can take to make sure you don't ever become victim to a wildlife attack. Now, you all know who I am. Many of you know Stephanie. Stephanie is a wildlife biologist like myself, but me and Stephanie will be giving the talk today. We're both wildlife biologists and large carnivore specialists. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background experience. Many of you know this, but if anyone wants to get a recording of this and they don't know who me and Stephanie are, we are going to introduce ourselves. So I'll go first. As you know, my name's Daryl Radijek. I'm a wildlife biologist, been that way throughout, the last 20-some years. I did receive my degree in wildlife management from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. I got my start working with wildlife and working with bears back in 1997. I was hired on as the first curator of the Appalachian Bear Center, which is now the Appalachian Bear Rescue. Did that for about 5 years, absolutely loved it. I was soon hired on by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and I was soon promoted to be the big game program coordinator. And so in that position, I was over all the bears, all the deer, all the elk, all the wild hogs in the state of Tennessee. Held that position for about 7 years, then they promoted me again for some strange reason, and they promoted me to the chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. Instead of being over those big, furry, cute animals, I was over all animals within the state. Did that for about another 5 years. Absolutely loved the job, but as a boy, when you always dreamed of living and working in the Rockies and you want to head west, when you work for the state of Tennessee, the furthest west you could go is Memphis, and that just wasn't mountainous enough for me. So anyway, I moved to New Mexico about 3 years ago and have been working in the Rockies, chasing dreams ever since. And part of the dream is actually what we're doing here tonight, talking to the people about wildlife. So that's enough about me. I'm going to turn it over to today's co-host, Stephanie Dennis. And Stephanie, if you want to describe yourself, have at it.
Sure. I'm Stephanie Dennis. Make occasional spots here on topics that are really kind of in my spectrum. Got my bachelor's in human and wildlife dynamics and wildlife biology from Oregon State University. And since I guess it's been 2013, I started coordinating the Wildlife Human Attack Response Training, which is a training program that we do once a year. We bring in a slew of experts and we train state, federal, and provincial agencies how to respond to severe and fatal wildlife attacks. Again, I started coordinating that actually when Daryl was still the chief of wildlife at Tennessee. Um, and I have been doing those. We only do one a year now because they're pretty large and I think, like this year we had to go to Alaska and it's a lot of logistics. And I do a lot of the legal liability, social media, and media conversations when we're actually at those events. Um, been a backpacker for quite a long time. Took a bit of a break whenever I was. Let me turn up my mic just a sec here. There we go. Started backpacking when I was a kid. Took a break when my kids were still in the growing up phase. They're ironically not very big outdoorsy folks. And then when they got a little older, um, the parents were older, I started doing a lot of solo backpacking, which is not necessarily something I actually recommend doing. It is much safer to hike with somebody else. But avid outdoorsman, there's a picture of my dog in there, and I'll take this moment to apologize right now. If he starts barking at any time during this, it will be loud, so I'm hoping he'll behave himself because he's sitting right next to me. But yeah, Daryl, Daryl was quite a bit of my mentor and a huge influence in my development in the wildlife career.
All right, thanks, Steph. I do want to give a quick shout out. I saw Joe popped on. Joe got a free seat in tonight's class because she was able to answer a question on the Facebook page about the Monty Python with the killer rabbit. So glad you joined in, Joe. Okay. All right, let's get started. I'll lead the way. Stephanie's going to be more or less the color commentator, and she has so many more. She's just so much more knowledgeable when it comes to these human wildlife attacks, and so I'm going to lean on her for quite a bit to provide some case studies that we know of that we'll be able to share with you and talk about a little bit as to why they happened. But what I want to do is just get started here and talk about why are we going to talk about wildlife attacks. And like I said a little while ago, unfortunately it happens all too often. For example, you can look, I just Googled headlines for different animals that cause attacks. And so everyone knows that bears can sometimes cause some damage, and so people are really familiar with bear attacks. Unfortunately, we had a couple of incidences in the Pacific Northwest within the last year or so that involved a couple of cougars. But when it comes to bears and cougars, it seems like many people expect those animals to be a part of it. And that's not always the case, because you don't have to look far and you can see that we've had incidences where bison have caused some pretty significant injuries in people. Moose are extremely, or can be extremely dangerous if you get too close to a moose. Little did you know it, but these really cute fuzzy white creatures called mountain goats can also be a little menacing if you get too close. Deer have been known to go after people in the right circumstances. Now, it doesn't always have to be the really big animals too. You think of an animal like a bobcat. Bobcats tend not to go after people. They're only just a little bit bigger than your house cat, but being a wild animal, if you get a cat that's a little bit bigger than your house cat, it can cause some damage. Another one, coyotes. This is something that is growing more and more in today's society, as coyotes have really expanded their range. And in some situations, they become bolder and bolder. They become habituated. They're not as skittish or afraid of people anymore. And so you sometimes have instances where someone may get injured because of a coyote attack. Everyone knows about raccoons. There are certain situations with raccoons where they can pose a threat to humans, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Some people get bit by snakes. This was the only picture I could find from a headline, but there's reasons why people get bit by snakes. Oftentimes it's because they don't leave them alone. I laughed at this because this was a headline that I just pulled up a little while ago, and it says a squirrel attack, but man, oh man, if you've got squirrels that look like that is something wrong going on with your squirrel. So, and then last but not least, even birds can attack people. Here's a situation where a goose went after someone up in Michigan. So it doesn't have to be these big scary animals that cause it, but what we want to do is look to see what's going on in these situations. Why are these things happening? And so, okay, sorry about that. I heard someone knocking at the door, but I think we're good. So what I want to do over the next half hour or 45 minutes or so is just talk about what is going on in these situations, and hopefully figure it out, and then figure out ways to avoid becoming a victim of some unfortunate incident like this. So to get started here, we're going to talk a little bit about wild animal behavior. And just looking at the list of people in today's class, I can almost guarantee that almost all of you, if not all of you, have attended some of my bear classes, in particular the language of bears, because we discuss different aspects about why or what situations you find yourself or you and that bear in, and that often dictates the behavior of that animal. So it goes far beyond just bears. I have a lot of bear pictures because I specialize in bears, and so that's usually my go-to. Um, but what you find out is animals react in certain situations. And so once again, there's those two big situations. There's those defensive situations and those offensive situations. And very much like my bear talk, when an animal is in a defensive situation, there's certain things that they're kind of reacting to. A lot of times when they engage in a human, what they're doing is they're defending their personal space. Again, I have a picture of a bear here, but for example, moose, if you get too close to a moose or any other large animal, whenever you're dealing with an animal that's comparable in size to us, they're not as likely to back down as, say, a squirrel or a raccoon. When you tower over an animal, it's going to be more likely to get out of your way. But the bigger that animal is, the more it will tend to defend its personal space. And so that's a big thing when it comes to animal behavior and what causes animals to react negatively to us. Another big one is food sources. A lot of this will depend on the amount of food that's available to the animal. And so when you have a lot of natural foods available and there's food to be found pretty much everywhere, those animals they will ignore you. They won't. They usually don't pay you any mind. But oftentimes in nature, we have what are called these food shortages, or we have these failures. And so the natural foods that generally sustain all wildlife sometimes aren't there, or they're not there in the quantity that makes it easy for those animals to find. So if you're in a situation where there's some type of food failure, whether or not it's a berry crop or acorns or whatever food that the animal is eating, and that animal is dependent upon that food source, that animal gets a little more defensive when it comes to making sure he doesn't lose that food source. And once again, that could lead to a sticky situation with a human. Another big thing, and you all know this, you're bear people by heart, in your heart like I am, and so offspring's a big thing. Everyone always knows you don't mess with a mother bear. But what about a mother bison or a mother a mother of any sort? A goose, for example. In fact, I'll have a picture there later. If you get too close to the offspring of many of these animals could react in a situation that could cause injury to a person. A lot of time that involves chasing the human, and the human might turn and fall or whatever, but you can still get an injury caused particularly by that wild animal. And then last but not least, from the defensive side of things, we're animals. Mating is a big part of our life. And so oftentimes in the natural world, it may only come once a year. And so you can imagine if you're an animal that gets this mating period that only occurs for maybe a few days or a few weeks throughout the year, that's your opportunity. And if something gets in between your chance to mate, oftentimes these animals don't tolerate that disruption. And so they're going to act defensively in defense of their potential mate. So those four things are the primary defensive situations that all wildlife are going to find are going to react to. And so you have to pay particular attention. And I mentioned in my bear safety classes is the situational awareness. What's going on with that animal? And these defensive modes are usually pretty easy to detect because you see the thing that animal is trying to protect. Now let's switch over to the offensive side of things. Again, if you've taken my bear class, there's a couple of different situations you have to be mindful of. Every once in a while, an animal will act aggressive. And what this aggressive behavior is the animal is, once again, it's trying to secure a food source. Instead of defending a food source, it's trying to get a food source out of you, whether or not it's in your backpack, whether it smells something on your clothes, whether it's around your house. An animal can become aggressive in search of food that is part of you, is near you, I should say. And so those behaviors are very distinctive. Whereas whenever I'm talking about defensive behaviors, an animal's trying to increase the distance, get away from you. In this offensive side of thing, an animal is trying to get closer to you because they're acting aggressive. They're trying to get that food reward out of you. And then, as most know, there's the worst situation of all, especially if it's a larger animal or a predator. You get this predatory behavior, and where they're not trying to get a piece of food from you, they're actually trying to get you. I will say this is the rare situation of all. This rarely ever occurs, but when it does, you got to be very mindful because this is when the most serious injuries take place. And unfortunately, many of the fatalities that take place is due to predatory behavior, especially in bears. And so those are the two main categories. You have that defensive situation for an animal that it's going to cause it to react. You have this offensive situation in an animal that's going to cause it to react. Both situations, there is this small likelihood that you can get injured from a wild animal. Now, I will tell you there are a couple of categories that don't fit this perfectly. And so actually a couple others. Every once in a while, you might have an animal that is diseased or possibly injured. They're not exhibiting defensive or offensive behavior. Literally, there's something wrong with that animal's mental state or physical state that can cause that animal to act out of the ordinary. So, looking at all of these things, whether or not it's this defensive, offensive, this injury or anything, there's one common thread throughout all of this is whenever you have an animal that is around a human and you're in one of these particular situations, it's causing the animal stress. The animal is stressed because you're too close to it. The animal is stressed because you're too close to its offspring or its food source. The animal is stressed because it's hungry and it's trying to find food. Or if it's injured, it's stressed. So whenever you have this stress elevating in a wild animal, there is always that small likelihood that that animal can react to a human and cause an injury. So before I go on, Stephanie, is there anything you want to add to any of these situations that you could think of?
Funny, haha, but funny, ironic thing is sometimes, especially when you look at things like the personal space, you may not notice that stress if you're encroaching on an animal's space, literally until it just triggers a reaction. We've seen, for example, some gorings that have happened with elk where a person might be standing in the middle of some cow elk and absolutely nothing seems to be happening. The elk just literally act like the guy's not even there until he just apparently in action or maybe the bull has had too much and then a bull turns around, charges him and ends up doing some damage to him. So it's literally one of those things where there are certain instances where it's better to just completely avoid the situation because you don't know what that trigger is going to be. And there are so many animals that are habituated or just really used to people these days that they might not show the original signs that we would always look for as this animal's being stressed out by proximity, by people just getting too close to it. So definitely something to keep in mind on the personal space issue.
Yeah, that's really good because one thing you have to understand, there are certain species that tolerate humans' presence more so than other species. So you could get closer to some animals than you can with other animals. But here's another really key thing to understand. Even within species, individual animals are very, very different. They all have different personalities. So you might say, oh, back home, I could walk within 5 feet of a raccoon or a deer, but if you're in the wild and it's a completely different animal, that animal's personal space could be drastically different. So just because you've encountered one situation with one animal, it does not mean it will parlay to every other animal encounter you have. So you got to take each situation slowly and just try to try to read that animal, try to understand what's going on, because that personal space is definitely one that can vary
Yeah, and
tremendously, not just
I
within
could just throw
species, or
an
not just by
anecdotal,
species, but within species as well.
sorry, an anecdotal in
Okay,
there.
so what
There are
I'm
times that
going to do,
even you might know or have
go
some
ahead.
prior experience with an animal that is a wild animal where maybe its range just it makes it a natural for you to see. I've been personally in an instance where I was doing some bear studies, and I was pretty familiar with um, a mother bear that had three cubs that was very close usually to a trailhead, which is the trailhead that I had to put in from. And just one day she reacted drastically different. She had always been a good bear when she heard me coming. If she didn't for some reason hear me, she would always just take off with her and her cubs, just like you would expect a bear to do. And then one day she apparently was having a bad day and decided that she was going to charge me from about 70 yards. Um, and that could have ended very, very poorly for me. And in my head, I was thinking, okay, I've given this bear a lot of personal space. There was no really real reason for her to react like that, but that doesn't change the fact that she did. So I know Daryl's mentioned it before in some of the bear lectures that he's done, but animals have mood shifts to some degree. As you know, it's not as much as a human may have, but they have moods too. So if you catch one on a day or they're just having a bad day, they may be prone to reacting when in the past you've not had a problem.
Okay, so let's jump into a bunch of these different situations, and we'll eventually talk about some cases that have happened. So what we're going to do, I'm going to start, instead of going into this defensive and offensive. Let me tackle some of these others right away, because they're pretty simple to understand. And so let's start out with this whole idea of disease. Now, you do know that some people get injured because an animal may be diseased, and I think the easiest one to talk about, because you hear about it every so often, and sometimes the injuries, it's not so much the injuries are physically devastating, but the potential for human um, fatality is really high if an animal is diseased and they bite a person, that can then transmit that disease to the human. And I think the classic example here is rabies. Rabies is a disease that's in wild animals that I'm gonna get all nerdy and geeky here, but it's classified as a zoonoses, and a zoonoses is literally a disease that can pass from a wild animal to a human. And rabies is probably the classic example. So the bad thing with rabies, you all know, if you get bit by a rabid animal, if you don't get the shots, you can develop rabies and you can die from it. And so it's something you got to be really worried about. But what we're talking about here is just kind of the injury part. And the crazy thing when it comes to rabies is when an animal becomes sick with the rabies virus, it changes that animal's behavior, and especially in these mesopredators like the raccoons and foxes, even coyotes can come down with rabies. The worst thing is domestic dogs are susceptible to rabies as well. That's why you get them vaccinated. But when rabies inflicts a wild animal, it changes their behavior and it makes them aggressive. So typically, a raccoon will be feeding on crayfish and insects and these small little creatures that they can find, as well as a lot of vegetable matter. But when a raccoon becomes rabid, something triggers it, and it will actually go after pretty much anything that it encounters. And so, whether or not they're bigger or smaller animals, that rabies disease changes their behavior, and that they are more likely to attack something they typically won't attack. And where I'm getting at is humans. And so, oftentimes, you see humans injured by rabid animals, and then the humans have to go through the whole rabies series because that animal is it's literally changed mentally. Um, another one, I'm not going to go into too much because we have a wildlife disease webinar coming up in a few months, but uh, a new disease that's on the horizon that's inflicting so many different animals, or so many different deer now, is chronic wasting disease. And what that disease does, it affects the brain of cervids, or deer and elk. That's the fancy word for deer and elk. And the thing is, when it begins affecting their brain, the animal, it's not that the animal will turn to attack people, but the animal begins losing its mental state, doesn't really know what's going on. And when that situation happens, the animal may appear listless, may not be afraid of you. You go up to it, and then that animal suddenly regains its awareness, and it could lash out at you. And so oftentimes disease will cause an animal to turn on a human and cause injury in humans.
I
Steph,
know
can
that
you
right
think of
now
any
in
other
India,
disease that I should
we're
mention?
hearing,
If not,
well,
we'll move on.
a lot of people are hearing a lot of news about raccoons with distemper, and they're calling them the zombie raccoons. And sometimes you'll see these types of, it almost feels like it's an epidemic because news stations will catch on to it. They'll get a few different alerts. But in the cases of distemper, while it's not an actual zoonotic where it's the zoonoses where it goes from the person, excuse me, the animal to the person, it is something that is very affecting dogs. So I would probably bring that one up, but that's mostly because it's really big in the media right now in like the Chicago area and some other large cities.
Okay, so that was an easy one. Everyone knows that diseased animal is no animal you want to mess with, because sometimes their mental state alters them, and they'll come after humans. Here's another one. Now, I know my crowd here. You guys are awesome. You're animal lovers, and you just can't bear to think of an animal being injured. You want to help that animal. I do too. I think it's only human nature to try to help an animal that's injured. But understand those situations are sometimes a little sketchy to get into, because what happens when an animal is injured? You might be able to approach it, but again, imagine you being a small animal, whether or not it's a bird or even a small mammal, and you have this extremely large human that is coming to pick it up. There's going to be a certain reaction to that. I love this picture here. I didn't take this picture, but the reason I'm bringing it up is when I was working in Tennessee, we had an injured Cooper's hawk that somebody had rescued, and the gentleman I worked with went to help deliver that Cooper's hawk to a rehabilitator. And he went there, and he was a wildlife biologist. He knew how to handle animals, but suddenly that Cooper's hawk let loose, and it sunk its talons into this person's stomach, and it would not let go. And so he ended up going to the hospital to have those wounds treated, because it's just an animal. I know the animal didn't want to do that, would prefer not to do that, but whenever you're dealing with an injured animal, there is huge opportunity to become injured yourself if you don't handle them properly. So anytime you do encounter an injured animal, we're always stressing, call the wildlife agency, call a wildlife rehabber to find out what to do. But you have to be very, very, very careful around any injured animal. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because we've got a ton to do today. So let's go into this. Now here's a big category. This is that defensive behavior. And again, in my bear classes, you've heard a lot of this stuff. But whenever you encounter an animal, doesn't matter if it's a bear, it could be this pig or a fox or a coyote or even a bird. Oftentimes, if you corner an animal or you get close to an animal, that animal has two options. And literally, this is, it's pretty much pre-programmed into their brain how this animal is going to react. I'm going to see who can guess it. What are the two options? Anyone know? This is where you could type something in. I'll give you a hint, and I guarantee everyone will know. These are the two words. Very good, Melissa. Yeah, fight or flight. That is literally pre-programmed in almost every mammal, wild animal out there. Is when you get cornered and your life is on the line, there's only two reactions you're going to do. You're either going to fight it out or you're going to run away. That's the flight. And so, for the most part, whenever we're dealing with humans getting injured, it's the result of that animal choosing fight. And so even the smallest animals, when their life is on the line, they will have a tendency to go after someone if that is what their brain tells them to do. Now, generally, you don't get injured in flight unless you're in the path of where they're trying to run to. But the good news is, whenever you do encounter most wild animals, their initial reaction, preferably, is always flight. And believe it or not, there's an evolutionary adaptation to that. You are more likely to survive if you can run away than if you could fight your way out of it. Because whenever you fight, there's a real good tendency that you too are going to get injured. And so this is why most animals will prefer that flight option. They want to, if they can get away without getting hurt, that's what they're going to do. I think most humans are that way too. If you have an opportunity to elude a sticky situation, you'd rather just avoid that situation than have to fight it out. There are some people that like fighting, but fortunately wild animals tend not to do that. So let's talk about some of these defensive situations that we've already mentioned. And we're going to start with this personal space. Now, I'll show you this picture. This was one of our lead-in pictures. I love this picture. Bob Howdeshell, again, fantastic photographer. This was actually a young mother bear. It looks like a cub, but that is a mother bear that someone got in her personal space. Her cubs weren't around, but she didn't like that personal space. But here's the thing. A lot of people look at bears and they're like, who in their right mind would ever approach a bear? We're smart enough to not go near bears. But I can almost guarantee every one of you have seen loads and loads of pictures like this. And so oftentimes when you are in a national park or whatever setting, it's wonderful to see a bear. The problem is you oftentimes lose your mind first and you think, hey, I got to get close to that bear and get a picture of that bear. And in our attempt to get close or to see the animal better or get that perfect picture, we are invading the personal space of that animal. Now, just like this picture shows, that animal is more intent on flight. It would rather run from the situation. But the fact that it's reacting like that, you know that animal was triggered. Its brain was triggered to react. And so you have to understand, every once in a while, it doesn't happen all too often, but there could be a situation where that bear is then triggered, hey, maybe I'm cornered. I can't run out of here. I've got to fight my way out of here. And it always just boggles my mind whenever you go to a national park and you see the crowds literally encircling an animal, especially if it's up in a tree. They'll encircle an animal and not give that animal a place to go. And you're forcing that animal's hand. And that could cause one of these attacks that is so unfortunate, because literally it's not that animal's fault that it had to make that decision. But like I said, it's not always just bears. Oftentimes we take for granted some of these other animals that we get too close to in attempts to get that perfect picture. And so this was an unfortunate incident up in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Too many people were getting close to these elk trying to get the pictures, and this particular elk just got too habituated and started going up to people. Now understand that a full-grown bull elk, which this one would have been, can grow to over 700 pounds. Can you imagine the injury that bull elk could inflict if it decides to get mad or takes off running or just charges someone? And so this is why the Park Service can't really take too much of a risk to have these animals make that decisions on their own. And so, like I said, it does not have to be bears or cougars or any of these scary animals. These other larger animals can easily inflict damage. Have you ever seen anything like this? You see it all the time. Unfortunately, it's becoming a really commonplace thing to get selfies with wild animals. And actually, Steph, do you have any background information or any stories regarding bison or anything else in which
Actually,
people have
when
become
it
injured?
comes to the personal space and the injuries that can ensue, more often than not, it's actually going to be one of these large herbivores, because as a general rule, they feel less scary to people. They generally tend to be a little more low key. So people do find that they treat them kind of like a cow that's in a pen, and they think that they can get closer to them. So it is far more common for people to be injured by the moose, the bison, the elk, deer, just from encroachment on their personal space. But it doesn't even have to be a large animal like that. I actually do know one of our case studies where a little boy decided that he was going to go swimming in a pond. So you think big pond, lots of space, and there was actually a family of otters that apparently called that pond theirs, and they literally swam across. The mom was up on the bank, and watched the family of otters swim across and pretty much start taking on the boy because he was in their space. And for them, that entire pond region was considered their home. So a lot of times I think the biggest problem does come from the fact that people just don't look at these animals and assume danger. They may do that when they see like Daryl said, the big scary animals, the bears, the cougars, the wolves or whatever. But generally speaking, they'll get themselves into trouble. We've seen tons and tons of incidents like this, and some of them end up bad. A lot of times it's not a really serious injury, but you can guarantee it's still a life-saving injury. And at the same time, it's a very, very selfish thing for people to do because they want to record that moment. They want to tell all their friends because how cool is that? But it's a very selfish thing to do that puts yourself at risk. But in addition to that, a lot of times it's going to also put that animal at risk. Sometimes the animal, um, if it's an obvious thing, they may not have to put that animal down. But like Daryl said, when you have instances where you have a known animal that has started to develop a reaction that occurs frequently, or if it's one reaction that's bad enough, it's a requirement that that animal pretty much has to be put down because if that animal were to do anything else, it's pretty much a slam dunk lawsuit because there was a known danger to a public hazard from a wild species, and then they didn't address that, and then thereby they willingly put other people at risk. So it's just all around. It's a very very dangerous thing to do for these kinds of selfish things, just to have that experience. It's much better to invest a little bit more money in a better camera and stay a safe distance away. It keeps you safe and it keeps the animals.
I'm so glad that Stephanie mentioned it's not always those big scary animals because my next picture, people look at squirrels, and believe it or not, I've seen this happen in a park. It wasn't particularly a squirrel, but I've seen where chipmunks would be coming up and people would be feeding the animals, and I've watched as kids would reach down and pick up the chipmunks. Can you imagine if you were that particular animal and this giant creature just suddenly reaches out and grabs you? You have one reaction, that's to defend yourself. And so grabbing any type of wild animal, no matter how big or how small, opens you up to getting bitten by that animal. And so that is the ultimate violation of personal space when you actually manhandle or pick up an animal. And so you're just asking to become injured by getting bit by that animal. Okay, I put this picture up here. This is the last thing I'm going to mention about personal space. Big, big, big animal. He doesn't look real scary. He kind of looks goofy with the big antlers and the big nose and the beard. And they're huge animals in excess of 1,000 pounds. And if this animal gets upset with you, they can run you over. They can literally kill you with one swipe of their hoof. But the reason that smiley face is there is because there's something going on more and more these days that people tend not to be too concerned or too aware, at least some people, and that is they love going out into the wild with these little guys, little little yappy dogs, which are great companions. But when you are out in the wilderness and you have an animal, a little animal like that is bolder than bold and will go after an animal 100 times its size, that can cause that animal to react. And if that big bull moose goes after that dog and that dog runs towards you, you've got over 1,000 pounds of mean, fierce moose snot coming right at you. So just be mindful whenever you are hiking or camping or out anywhere in the wild around wild animals with your pets. Your pets can invade their personal space and agitate that animal into causing a reaction. Now, obviously, it could injure your pet, but that animal could then quickly turn on you and injure you. So, a lot of attacks are triggered because of dogs that are, especially if those dogs are unleashed. So please be mindful of that. And that's the last thing I'm going to say about these defensive, this personal space issue. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the food. I'm not going to spend too much time on here because it's pretty common sense. There are some animals out there that depend on making a kill in order to feed themselves. Now, this eagle obviously didn't bring down this elk, but you have lots of scavengers out there. You have lots of predators out there that are required to make a kill in order to survive, especially the true carnivores like a cougar. Obviously, whenever there is a carcass nearby and that is serving as a food source for any type of predator or scavenger, that animal is likely to defend that food source. And so Stephanie could probably go into countless stories about people getting injured when they approached an animal a carcass, but I'm not going to have you do that just yet. But it does not have to be a meat source. Understand that there's lots of different food sources out there. And so there's animals that are feeding on berries or acorns. And like I said before, if we have a food failure or a mast failure, like this berry crop failure, and there's not a lot of berries out there, if there's an area in the woods that is particularly, it's doing well and lots of animals are being drawn to it because there's not a lot of other food, there is a tendency for some of those animals to become defensive of that food source. Even though it's not a hunk of meat laying on the ground, they could protect that food source. And believe it or not, it doesn't have to be natural. Wild animals, unfortunately, sometimes defend unnatural food sources. Ugliest picture you want to see there, it's that overflowing garbage can, because this leads to so many problems with bears that you all are aware of. But bears can actually defend an unnatural food source like a dumpster or a garbage can that has garbage in it. So just be mindful. Just because you're not in the middle of the wilderness somewhere, you could be camping somewhere at this beautiful chalet in bear country, and you can walk out to the dumpster to take the trash out for that evening, and there could be an animal there that is pretty protective of his unnatural food source. So just be mindful. You got to think outside the box sometimes. Okay, so let's move on to this whole idea of offspring. Now, there is plenty of time to talk about bears, and we will, but has anyone ever gotten too close to a bird? Or it doesn't have to be a goose here, but sometimes you might get too close to a nest and you will have a bird come screaming at you, whether or not they're running at you, flapping their wings, or flying at you through the air. Oftentimes, even robins have attacked Melissa here. So Melissa's been ravaged by robins and coyotes. So everyone knows this. The animals, they have this strong maternal instinct, and they will defend their offspring. And so it could be the littlest bird, it could be a big bird, it could be any type of mammal. You've got to be very wary of this maternal instinct. These are, all right, can anyone guess, are these fox pups or coyote pups? Anyone believe they're fox? Good. You guys are awesome. You must have an awesome wildlife teacher or something. Um, one of the easiest ways, because oftentimes a lot of people ask, that they'll see something like that and they'll think they're fox. Just look at their paws. In almost every situation, those fox pups will have black paws, and so those red fox, even the gray fox, will have those socks on their paws. And so these are coyote pups, and I'm so gosh darn proud of you guys. You did good. here's a situation. I'm sure everyone was aware that this could be really dangerous. You think moose are big and nasty. You try getting close to a bison calf. Those things, their heads are bigger than most of us sitting in this classroom. They can be extremely ornerous animals, especially if you get too close to their offspring. And does everyone recall probably about 5 or 6 years ago the person that saw the lone bison calf by itself and it put it in its truck and brought it back because they thought it was orphaned? Terrible, terrible story. But this is where people aren't using their head. Could have been a very, very dangerous situation. But obviously, probably the most well known is we're always talking about bears and bears being protective of their offspring. Steph, do you want to give the situation of um,
Oh, yeah.
the two
Um, yeah,
folks
I think
from
I know what you're
Yellowstone, the
talking
tourists that
about. It,
this
Brian
is on
Matayoshi. Um, but yeah, so
Miyamoto.
we had a case study. It was interesting for lots of um, research and educational reasons, but there was a hiker and his wife that were hiking through the Yellowstone area, and they saw a mom with some cubs. Um, they actually, with there was a photographer that they had run across whenever they were going into a trail area, but it ended up at the time they were a perfect distance away. They were fine and at a good distance. But the way that the mother bear was traveling with her cubs, the couple did not know, but they were going to intersect at a relatively close proximity if both were traveling at just that right pace. Um, and lo and behold, that of course is what happened. The couple comes through a corner where that field was just separated by a small edge row of trees, and that mother bear had come through at just about the same time. And when she saw them, um, they actually reacted in a really, I mean, it's an understandable way, but not a way that we recommend. The mom started to get a little aggressive with them and do some bluff charges, just the usual things that a bear does when it's expressing stress reactions because it's being defensive of its offspring. And the people actually turned and ran, and the husband ran slower than the wife, so the husband actually took the entire brunt of that attack. The, they also the bear did actually get the wife a little bit as well, but it was a case where literally they've done everything right, but situational awareness again. It was just one of those. The mom really had an aggressive response when it came to defending her offspring. So is that the case you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we have to stress the situation with bears and their cubs. Doesn't matter if it's a black bear or a grizzly. And I will just mention quickly Kim DeLozier, who most of you know as he's the retired biologist from Great Smoky Mountain National Park. He tells the story oftentimes of the gentleman from Alabama that followed that cub into the woods in an attempt to get a picture of that cub, and he was just literally chasing this cub, and Mama didn't react too nicely, and that bear injured that gentleman, but it did not. The bear was just defending its cub. But what it did, it swatted the gentleman. It literally pushed the gentleman into a tree. Didn't bite him, didn't scratch him, didn't do it. It literally just pushed him away. And the gentleman ended up getting impaled in a very sensitive part of his body. And Kim jokes around all the time because as soon as he heard that the bear didn't really attack the gentleman, they pulled the traps. They didn't want to catch that bear. In fact, Kim said if he could replicate that bear's DNA and spread it all throughout the Smokies, he would do that. But it's just a situation where it's that situational awareness, knowing that chasing a cub is not a good thing. You all are way smarter than some of the some of the folks you see out there, and so offspring is just a no-no. It doesn't matter if it's a bear or a deer or even a bird. Those little babies usually have a mom around that's going to be pretty defensive of it. So let's move on to the last situation in this whole defensive mindset, that mating season. Now, remember, I told you that a lot of times these wild animals only get to mate once a year for a very, very short period of time. It might be a few weeks, might be a few days. And so they're pumped up on adrenaline, whether or not it's testosterone or whatever raging through them. And these animals become hyperactive, very aggressive in their behaviors because they're fighting for that sole opportunity to mate, which does not come along. So it's kind of understandable that they can become aggressive. Uh, Great picture here again by Bob Howdeshell. This is a bull moose. He's sniffing the air, just trying to find that female cow that is receptive. And so these big bull moose, mentioned it before, they can get up over 700 pounds. You get in between that bull moose and his harem, his group of cows that he has selected to mate with, and there can absolutely definitely be injuries that take place. You can literally Google lots and lots of videos that will show these big bull moose chasing people that get too close to their harems. I don't know, Stephanie, if you wanted to
That's yeah,
mention
and that's
anything
actually the case
here,
that we were
you're
talking about
welcome
a
to.
little bit ago. And it's not an uncommon thing because these bull elk are very protective of their harem, and while the cows may not be reacting and people again encroach on that space, this guy, his entire world during that time of the year is pretty much just taking care of his females and making sure that they're good. So yeah, but we've had multiple instances where you've seen bull elk that have negative interactions with people just because the person wasn't even near the bull, but they were near the cows. So again, that mating drive really, really.
Okay, and for some reason I'm thinking I might have said bull moose. That's a bull elk, in case I did say it wrong. I apologize for that. Okay, enough about the defensive. You understand that animals are going to be protective of certain things, whether or not it's their space, their mate, their offspring, their food source. That leads us to some of these offensive situations that you might find yourself in. And again, the whole preventative side of this is knowing the situation that you're engaging these animals. And so there is that situation of this aggressive behavior. Now, I'm going to put this picture up. This is a picture of a bear that was exhibiting some kind of aggressive behavior. If you notice that he's acting kind of stealthy, the head down a little bit. The bear is in this situation. Um, he's trying to get closer to the person that had the camera, and so this is what we would deem as aggressive behavior. Literally, what the bear is doing, it may not have been interested in the person itself, but it's trying to seek a food reward. And so, again, if you take my bear classes, we talk about this quite a bit. There are certain ways you need to react because you got to let this bear know that he cannot get a food reward from you. And so, this is where you act big and strong and try to scare that bear away. But these are situations, just think about the general public. The general public misinterprets these behaviors all the time. Some people will see a bear coming close looking for food as something really cute, may even want to feed that bear. That bear is not interested in being cute. That bear is interested in getting one thing. And if you don't have that one thing, you let that bear get too close to you, and then you don't have that one thing, lots of people get bitten, lots of people get swatted. Usually, this isn't like a full blown attack on the person, they're just trying to get whatever food that they can get. Now, I bring up bears because this is probably the most easily identifiable, but there's other animals that could exhibit some of this aggressive behavior. And so I bring up this animal. Super duper duper cute. I think mountain goats are one of the coolest looking animals. They're shaggy white fur. There have been instances, unfortunately, it was a really bad incident, and I'm going to let Stephanie explain this one, but there has been instances where even mountain goats have exhibited this aggressive behavior. They don't like people being around. They're pressing these people. And Steph, if you wanna bring up that situation, I think this is one that not many people know about because people look at a mountain
So
goat and
just
think
for the
how cute it
record,
is and just would love to get close and
maybe
get a
I'm a
picture, but
weirdo,
bad
but
things can
knowing the
happen.
size that these guys get, I don't know that cute's exactly the right word. Because these guys are huge. They can be now the baby ones. Granted, those are I'll admit those are cute.
Yes, it is.
So the thing that we've noticed with some of these mountain goats is I know Daryl has in his bear classes he's used the word habituation with you and food conditioned. So when you look at a food conditioned animal, to really put it in kind of simplistic terms, it's almost like that animal has become addicted to using humans to get food rewards or in other types of things of that nature. So when you look at an animal like a goat, you're thinking, well, there's no way really that it's going to get food conditioned or habituated. Maybe the habituation, but not the food conditioned. The problem is goats are extremely attracted to salt. So we've seen lots of instances in the Pacific Northwest where these and goats there, for the record, they're not a native species there. They were actually introduced many, many years ago for hunting opportunities, but now they find that they've got these huge goats that are, yeah, Melissa's nailed this one, but we've got these huge goats that have discovered that various things that humans have or leave behind can be great sources of salt. So chip bags, sweaty bandanas, actually sweat on the person. Believe it or not, urine contains a very large amount of sodium smell that goat is just really enticed by. So they saw just many situations where these goats really were trying to start hanging out in places they knew that humans hung out in. And it wasn't because they really wanted anything other than these potential sources for salt. Um, they had to put up a lot of signs warning about the aggressive behavior of these goats because the goats were not just getting to the point where they would go hang out and want to, you know, lick a block where somebody maybe had gone to the bathroom or where somebody had left a bag of chips or something. They were actually starting to pressure the humans physically to try to get them to drop things. Um, so it was really it's an interesting behavior when you think about it, but it's a really scary and bad behavior because again, when you look at this goat, you really have to imagine this guy's 370 pounds. That is bigger than most black bears that people encounter, and those horns that guy is sporting are extremely dense and very sharp, even if they don't look like it. So in the case of the Olympic Peninsula in the park, they actually had goats that they had been trying to find places to send them because they knew that these goats were eventually going to do somebody a whole lot of harm. Um, and it just so happened that one day a couple and their friend were walking up a trail, and one of these goats that was really salt conditioned was walking down the trail, and the family did everything right. They were very kind of slowly waving their hiking poles. The two females were backing up, and the male that was in the party, he was trying to kind of stay between the goat and the females because the goat showed absolutely zero fear of humans. It knew that those humans were a potential source of salt, and that was all that its mind was focused on. And then at some point, again, it went very poorly because when the animal, I guess maybe it's up whatever triggered in its head, it wasn't getting what it wanted, it wasn't getting it fast enough. Something triggered, and he lowered his head and he charged, and he did actually injure a man, and it ended up in a fatality because it gored him in the thighs. So of course that having very large arteries that run through there, it ended up being a fatality. So, but when people, again, we can't kind of say it enough. People always are kind of sensationalizing the danger from bears and cougars and wolves, when in reality, probably the more dangerous are usually the herbivores because we don't see them that way. We let our guard down, and there's a lot of conditions that these animals can actually act out into that we have to always kind of keep vigilant of.
Thanks, Steph. Your your knowledge of these incidences is impressive. But I guess the moral of the story is you have to be mindful of any wild animal out there. If it's acting in a behavior that is just does not seem right. You got to take extra precautions because the last thing you want to do is get in the way of a 370-pound mountain goat that is acting aggressive. So just be mindful of that. Now, the last offensive situation I'll bring up, and we won't spend a lot of time. In fact, we've had a few webinars based solely on this. This idea of predatory behavior. Now, understand that there are some animals that eat other animals for a living, so they have to make a kill in order to survive. And so obviously alligators, things like that, that everyone is aware of. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of incidences in the Pacific Northwest where we've had predatory attacks by cougars. They make the paper. Understand this is not typical. Humans are not typically on the menu when it comes to these large carnivores, whether or not it's a bear or a cougar. And the reason I say that with confidence, and I don't mind saying that, is if we were a regular menu item, there are so many cougars each and every day that can easily take down a human, but they don't. It's usually only in times of stress where an animal may be underweight, hasn't eaten in a while, or oftentimes one of the big things that's growing more and more, you have these mountain bikers that move through an area at a really high rate of speed. And that sometimes triggers predatory responses. When you have an animal that is hunting other fast-moving animals, if you are a human and you move by that animal fast, that animal could be triggered to go after you. And so that's predatory behavior when an animal actually seeks a human as the food source. Again, I hate bringing this up because it's so rare, but it can happen. It does happen every once in a while. But you got to be mindful of the situation that you may be in or you may be putting yourself in that could trigger some of this predatory behavior.
Should just go on,
anything you want to add about this, Steph, before I move on?
Page if you let me.
Okay. Yeah, I figured you would. Okay, well, I'm going to have you talk about something else. Because we talked about the disease. Every once in a while, there's some miscellaneous stuff that it's not really the animal's fault. For example, there is the drug-induced. I mentioned about that video that I posted on Facebook. If you saw that grizzly that awoke from the sedation and went after all the folks in those vehicles, you could see that bear was pretty upset. And in fact, I'm not even going to ask Stephanie to go into this because there have been situations where people have actually been killed because of this rage. You have to understand when you use these mind-altering drugs to sedate an animal, to knock it down, perform whatever work you perform on it, sometimes those animals wake up from that drug-induced coma, so to speak, and they wake up in a rage. And unfortunately, if you're anywhere nearby, it could be a bad thing that happened. And we had a fatality. Was it Montana?
It was Wyoming.
Yeah, and so there's been some attacks that were no fault of the animal, no fault of the human. It was just a bad situation that they found themselves in. But I will mention one other thing, and this is something I learned. Actually, I learned it from Mark Bruschino, who teaches, who used to be a teacher for some of these wildlife human attack trainings that they had put on. Stephanie knows Mark Bruschino. But we were sitting at a bar. I was drinking Diet Coke, but just talking to Mark, just trying to figure out what causes these wildlife attacks, because they're so rare, they're so unfortunate, and oftentimes they're so terrible. And I couldn't help but remember. He said, Mark said to me, he said, Daryl, just understand, every once in a while you might catch an animal in a bad mood. Something could have just happened right before you got there, and that animal was just looking to get in a fight, and there's no one at fault there. And so occasionally that happens. Now, I have the picture of the pig up there because they're always in a bad mood and they're always looking to run people over. But sometimes you have those situations where you're just in the wrong spot at the wrong time. And again, there's no one to blame. Probably not we know it's not the human to blame. Sometimes it's not the animal to blame. Sometimes they're just in a situation. Put it this way, we're all animals. You ever wake up or you ever just be in a really bad mood, don't really know why, but you can't get out of it? I imagine that happens throughout the animal kingdom. And unfortunately, when those things happen, it could be a bear, it could be a raccoon, it could be a fox, it could be anything, and you just find yourself in just the wrong spot at the wrong time, and unfortunately, you end up with injuries or worst case scenario, those occasional fatalities. Before I start wrapping it up here, I looked at the time. We're well over an hour already. I knew we had run out of time quick. Anything you want to add about any animal behaviors? Because I'm gonna start wrapping up. All right, I'll need you here to answer some questions. But the last thing I wanted to let you know, and sorry the slide didn't come out right. I do appreciate Stephanie for joining us. She coordinates these wildlife human attack response trainings, literally all across North America, including Canada. And so if you all have any questions whatsoever, I can almost guarantee that if I can't answer it, Stephanie can. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to summarize what we were talking about today. It just amazes me how fast time flies. But just to summarize everything, animals can react unpredictably. It doesn't matter the size of the animal, the species of the animal. They can do things that catch us off guard, and we can become injured, or worst case scenario, we can get killed by a wild animal. Thankfully, that is extremely rare. But you have to understand, these animals are usually reacting to stressful situations, and we went through a whole bunch of those. And so the key here to prevent yourself from ever becoming a victim, there isn't equipment. You don't carry pepper spray. You don't carry any of that other stuff. Well, you can, but the best thing you carry is your brain. That situational awareness to see what's going on with that animal. Because you're going to put that animal unknowingly in a defensive mode or an offensive mode, or some of these other miscellaneous stuff. You could see an animal that's not acting right, that could be diseased. As long as you know the situation that you're finding yourself with that animal, you just know how to avoid or not to get too close to an animal if the situation is something that could result in that animal kind of turning on a human. And so the best thing to do, doesn't matter what wild animal you're talking about, treat them like they truly are. Treat them as wild animals. Don't approach them. Don't try to pet them. Don't try to feed them. Don't try to get too close. They get along just fine without us. In fact, they prefer to be without us. So let them be wild animals, and you shouldn't have anything to worry about. And so what I'm going to do is wrap things up here. I got to give the photo credits. Bob Hotteshell, again, is my go-to person. He's absolutely fantastic. I forgot to add Brian Peterson. He supplied a picture tonight as well. Before we go to answering any questions, y'all know how to log on to the website and look up what classes are coming up. Again, we're always looking for more comments on Facebook. Trish Stevens, she's not here today, but she runs our Twitter page. By all means, even if you've already left a comment, give us another comment. Let us know what the latest class is like, because new people coming in want to see the reactions of other folks. So please leave a comment. With that, I do want you to mark your calendars. It's getting pretty routine here. So 2 weeks from today, I'm doing a webinar. I don't even know why I'm doing this webinar, but people love bears, and so I got to figure out what I'm going to talk about here. But it'll be all about black bear reproduction. And so that webinar is called Love is in the Air, but it'll be all about bears. I'm going to be talking about grizzlies as well. So I got to redo my slide because it should just be bear reproduction. Then 2 weeks after that, this one should be a good one because this is one of the most misunderstood animals or group of animals. People are so fearful of snakes. There are some snakes to watch out for, but for the most part, most snakes are beneficial and don't want anything to do with you. And so I'm bringing in a specialist who deals a ton with snakes. He's fantastic. His name's Logan Barber. He'll help me with that one. But if you have any fear of snakes whatsoever, this is a great one. So tell your friends that just freak out over snakes, because we're going to show easy ways to identify different snakes, the good snakes, the bad snakes, and everything in between. So that is an awesome, awesome webinar to get you and your friends who are afraid of snakes to participate. And with that, I'm going to end it here and ask for questions. There's that picture that Joe got from Monty Python. Those were the killer rabbits, but I won't leave it there because some people might not like that picture. So I'll leave it with a happy picture. So y'all have any questions about any animal attacks, any ways to avoid them, any ways to recognize them, feel free. I'll stick around as long as you want. Stephanie might have to get going. I know she's apparently got an early day tomorrow. So any questions, guys? Y'all are like crickets today. I see Lori's typing something.
It's up to you.
Stephanie, you want the
But one
rabies
thing,
one, or you want me to
if
take
you're
it?
gonna talk about rabies, make sure you mention the bobcats, because bobcats, rabies, big thing in your neck of the woods, actually. So, do you want to handle the rabies vectors?
Well, you
Okay,
start.
so there
You
are
you mention
there are
what
some
you
animals
think
that
we
are
have to
more
mention, and then I'll
prone
fill in any gaps.
to rabies. I really, Daryl would have to answer if all animals get rabies. I know that we can, and I know that there are certain animals that tend to be a vector, and by a vector we just kind of mean they're a primary known for transmitting. So like the bobcats, the bats, the raccoons, um, they they're kind of well known um, pools for spreading the rabies virus around. Daryl, go ahead. I'm gonna field the rest of you.
No, you're doing good. There's certain species that are much more prominent or well known regarding carrying and um, uh, uh, being, like Stephanie said, being the vector to transmit rabies. The top ones you've got to worry about. Raccoons are a big one. Uh, Bats might be the next biggest, because a lot of people will end up with a bat in their house, or they'll see a bat on the ground. Bats tend not to be on the ground or around humans too much, and oftentimes, well, the brave people will pick up bats to try to help them out, and they end up getting bitten. And they got to go, as soon as they get bitten by a bat, doesn't matter what species it is, you got to go get your rabies shots. Um, and so bats, most of the canids, the foxes, the dogs, coyotes, any of those can transmit rabies. There are certain species that tend not to get it, even if bitten, will not develop or carry it. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, but opossums do
I'm
not
not
get
100% sure
rabies at
because
all.
yes, skunks.
Skunks are a big one. Susan just chimed in about skunks. Yes, skunks are a huge carrier of rabies. Here's something that is really interesting, and this might hit home for some of you. Whenever there's a rabies outbreak, usually they'll know like a certain part of the state where the rabies prevalence has increased, and they're finding it in more and more wild animals, whether or not it's raccoons or foxes. The USDA, um, will the United States Department of Agriculture, and I don't know which department it is, but they will oftentimes conduct these rabies drops. They're vaccines, and so, for example, I do know in East Tennessee there was a growing prevalence of rabies. This is a number of years ago, still there, and so the USDA, the EPA, I think it is, would come in and do these rabies drops. And what they do is they drop these little packets of a rabies vaccine that is designed to be eaten by raccoons and foxes. It's a little meal. I think it's made out of fish mostly, but they put the rabies vaccine in there. And so they will come by, drop these, trying to eliminate rabies in the wild animals. This is where conspiracy theorists go bonkers because they will see these low flying airplanes or these helicopters dropping these baits out, and they think the government's trying to poison something or do some nefarious action, and that's not the case. They're trying to help the wild animals. They're trying to help the human population by reducing the incidence of rabies. And so I always thought that was a really interesting to know that, or not many people know that the government does that occasionally, but
So
it has
another
been
thing,
done
really quick,
quite a
to go
bit in the
back up to the
past.
original question, um, we were also kind of asked how it affects behavior. So rabies, the way that it affects animal behaviors, it's actually um, on a lot of different levels because it can cause hysteria in it, which is why that animal that is does have rabies can act so strangely. I mean, you'll see, like Daryl said earlier, they will take on anything. I've seen a raccoon that granted, I didn't stop and check him out, but it was literally out in the middle of the road and it looked like it was trying to direct traffic. It was just reaching at cars as the cars were going by because it was experiencing that hysteria. But other things that can affect that, of course, you've got after the hysteria, there's paralysis, there's seizures, there's a lot of other different behavior changes that can also be a thing. And then to kind of chime in on some of the additional comments that we've had on that, it's not just the bites that you have to be worried about necessarily because there's a thing called post-exposure phoraxis that should be, I cannot say the second word right, but it has to be considered. So even if there wasn't a bite, there is oftentimes instances where, for example, the CDC might recommend that you still go get rabies shots because you have to absolutely be 100% certain that you didn't get a bite, scratch, or any kind of mucous membrane exposure in an animal that could have rabies if it is deemed to have had rabies. Does anyone know? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to answer. No, I was just going to answer Lori Gunter's question about bears having rabies. Yes, believe it or not, this past year there was, I think it was in Virginia, there was a bear that tested positive for rabies. It's rare; they don't happen. It doesn't happen all too often. But as far as the species being capable of uh, developing rabies and being a
So,
carrier,
and that
yes, bears
and
can
this kind
get
of is going to lead into
rabies.
my question, and this is a question for all of our attendees. So get your typing fingers ready. But do you know if you are bitten by an animal and you um, have access to take that animal for testing, does anyone know what part of that animal's body has to be tested to determine if it has rabies or not? Yes, it is in they need the head and the brain intact because that is where they have to go. So if ever you're in a situation where there's potential that you have an animal that has bitten somebody or um, a possibility for exposure to rabies, and you do have to put that animal down so that you can take it in to test it, because if the animal tests positive for rabies, then you know you need the shots. If the animal tests negative for rabies, it'll save you a whole lot of pain in the long run, and a series of shots. So make sure that you don't. And I don't want to gross you guys out, so I apologize for that. But the one thing you have to make sure you don't do is shoot an animal in the head, because that would take away the one opportunity for them to determine.
Lori, just your comment there. The one thing that I want people to understand because it strikes a nerve and it's a really heartfelt issue and it's understandable. Whenever an animal bites a human, oftentimes state agencies are forced to put that animal down, and a lot of times it is due to not the state wildlife agency but the Department of Health. Like Stephanie said, the only way to test an animal to see if it's diseased, especially if it's rabies, because rabies is a zoonosis, it can kill a human being if that human contacts it. So if an animal bites someone, in many states, and the reason I'm saying many, New Mexico is one of them. The Department of Health, not the State Wildlife Agency, the Department of Health said if that animal is caught, it must be tested for rabies. And so it puts the State Wildlife Agency in a bind because they'll catch the animal and then they're forced to put it down because of the Department of Health regulations. And so it's, unless you know the whole reasoning behind it, a lot of people are knee-jerk reaction just having negative reactions towards agencies or people or stuff, and sometimes their hands are tied due to regulations. And so, yeah, the best thing to do, don't get bit by a wild animal. So if you see an animal that's acting odd, and I could back Stephanie up 100%. I was in Allegheny State Park in New York. This was 40 years ago. That's I was only 1 year old back then. Um, no, it was a long, long time ago, and so I remember a raccoon just being in the middle of the road, would not let our car go by. It was attacking the wheel. It was going after the car every time we tried going by. And had we known better at the time, if I was a wildlife biologist back then, we would have tried to put that animal out of its misery. But we could not understand why this raccoon was challenging our car.
And another thing when we're talking about interesting diseases that, and I don't want to be a spoiler alert for your upcoming course, but I think that armadillos probably have a slightly bit of a bad rap. Armadillos can be leprosy
Yep.
vectors, but not, and it's a decent amount of the population that can actually carry the leprosy virus. But the probability of someone in a developed country getting leprosy is so uh, minuscule because just our genetics have helped build us up to do protections against that. But if that's not in your talk on that one, Daryl, make sure you
Oh
add that
no,
one because
that's one of
that's
my
good stuff
that's
because armadillos are traveling.
yeah, that's one of my pet peeves is whenever you're in social media or anywhere and someone mentions an armadillo or puts a picture up there, guaranteed within a matter of minutes someone will say, "Ooh, they carry leprosy." And they do, but the odds of you
Yeah.
getting sick, leprosy is an old world disease. Nowadays, it's easily treated by antibiotics, and so in developing countries, it could still be an issue, but around here, it's not much of an issue. But you still don't want to expose yourself to it.
Anybody else have any questions for us? Because if not, I am probably going to bail.
All right, we have been going on an hour and 20 minutes, and it blows me away every time I do this because I'm always panicky beforehand to say, "Oh my gosh, I hope we have enough to talk about." And before too long, we're well over an hour. So I do want to say you guys are awesome. I can't thank you enough for your participation in these and your willingness to learn from a couple of wildlife geeks who just love what we do. So thank you all so much for joining in tonight. And with that, I want to thank Stephanie once again for helping me out today. And you guys were awesome. And stay tuned for an upcoming webinar. And don't forget, leave us a Facebook comment, even if you've already left one before.